大家好，我是 Jenny， 欢迎来到沉思者 J。 你有没有想过，你以为自己做的每个决定都是你自己选的，但其实在你意识到之前，有个黑暗的力量早就替你决定好了。这个力量叫做无意识，而第一个把它带到人类面前的人，就是今天我们要说的大师西格蒙德弗洛伊德。他打开了一个潘朵拉的盒子，从此人类再也不能假装自己完全了解自己。我是 Jenny， 欢迎来到向大师致敬系列。今天让我们一起走进这位改变了人类自我认识的伟大思想家。弗洛伊德出生于1856年5月6日，出生地是当时奥匈帝国的摩拉维亚省，也就是今天捷克共和国的弗莱贝格小镇。父亲雅各·弗洛伊德是个羊毛商人，是犹太人，家境说不上富裕，但非常重视教育。母亲阿玛利亚比父亲年轻20岁，她对西格蒙德有着近乎偏执的溺爱，她总是叫他黄金西吉，认为他是天选之人。弗洛伊德后来分析说，一个被母亲深爱的人，往往充满征服世界的勇气。这句话是不是有点在自夸？但说不定也是真的。他一生的勇气和自信确实有几分这个根源。弗洛伊德4岁时全家搬到维也纳，这座城市将成为他一生的舞台。他在家中8个兄弟姐妹中排行老大，从小就展现出惊人的学业天分。他精通8种语言，包括德文和希伯来文、拉丁文和希腊文，还有英文和法文、意大利文和西班牙文。这孩子不是普通的聪明。1873年，17岁的弗洛伊德进入维也纳大学医学院。他原本对法律有兴趣，但听了一场关于大自然的演讲后，突然立志研究自然科学。那场演讲的内容让他深受感动，他决定要去探索自然的秘密。他在医学院的求学路走得有点慢，整整花了8年才毕业，因为他中途跑去跟着动物学家布吕克研究鳗鱼的生殖器官。对，你没听错，是鳗鱼。他的第一个研究题目是在找鳗鱼的睾丸，但一直没找到。这个研究最后以失败告终，但科学就是这样，失败也是一种贡献。而且他在这段时期学到的解剖技术和科学训练，为他后来的工作打下了基础。1881年，弗洛伊德终于取得医学学位。他在维也纳综合医院开始临床工作。最初他其实想走脑神经科学的路，他在脑神经解剖上的研究相当扎实。他发现了可卡因有局部麻醉的功效，这个发现在当时轰动一时。后来有个眼科医生用了这个发现，做了第一个眼科局部麻醉手术。弗洛伊德因为没继续深入研究这个方向，而与一个重大医学发现擦肩而过。他也因为可卡因吃了苦头，他建议好友弗莱施用可卡因治疗吗啡上瘾，结果弗莱施不止没好，反而又多了一个可卡因上瘾。这是他医学生涯的一个黑历史，他后来很少主动提起这件事。1885年，弗洛伊德得到了一个改变命运的机会，他获得奖学金前往法国巴黎，跟随神经学大师让马丁沙可学习。沙可是当时研究歇斯底里症的顶尖专家，他每周都会在公开讲堂展示歇斯底里症的病人。这种疾病当时主要发生在女性身上，症状包括瘫痪、失明，甚至痉挛，但找不到任何身体上的原因。沙可的观点让弗洛伊德大开眼界，他开始思考一个问题：如果身体没有问题，为什么人会出现这些症状？那个原因一定在心理里面。回到维也纳后，弗洛伊德开始跟老朋友约瑟夫·布罗伊尔合作。布罗伊尔是维也纳知名的内科医生，也是个非常有智慧的人。他有一个著名的病人，后来在病历里被称为安娜欧，她真实的名字是贝尔塔帕彭海姆。这个女人有各种奇怪的症状，手脚瘫痪，视力出问题，说话也困难。有时候他会忘记如何说德语，只能说英文。布罗伊尔让他在催眠状态下说出心里的事，症状居然就消失了。他把这个方法叫做宣泄疗法。 说白了就是让病人把憋在心里的话说出来。这给了弗洛伊德极大的启发。弗洛伊德后来把这种病人对治疗师的情感投射发展成移情的理论。他认为这不是问题，而是治疗过程中最重要的材料。1896年，弗洛伊德的父亲去世了，这件事对他打击很大。他在给朋友的信里写道，他感觉一扇重要的门在他面前关上了。他开始进行一个前所未有的实验，他对自己进行自我分析，他记录自己的梦，分析自己的童年记忆，探索自己的潜意识。每天晚上他都会在床边的笔记本里把刚做的梦写下来，然后仔细分析每一个细节，每一个符号，每一个奇怪的场景背后可能隐藏的意义。这个过程持续了好几年，也成为他最重要作品的基础。1900年，弗洛伊德出版了一本书，这本书叫做《梦的解析》，他认为这是他一生最重要的著作。在书中他提出，梦不是随机的神经杂讯，而是通往无意识的皇家大道。每个梦都有意义，都是被压抑的欲望在伪装后的呈现。梦的显意是我们记得的那些场景，梦的隐意才是真正的心理内容。就像一封被密码加密过的信，表面看起来是一件事，解码之后却是另一件事。但这本书刚出版的时候，几乎没有人理睬。第一版只卖出351本，整整花了8年才卖完。这对一个充满自信的天才来说，是个相当残酷的开始。他自己预言说，这本书会在100年后被人记住。他说的没错，只不过不需要等100年。弗洛伊德没有放弃，他继续发展他的理论体系。他提出了几个后来家喻户晓的概念。第一个是无意识的理论。弗洛伊德把心灵比作冰山，意识只是露出水面的小小一角，水面下巨大的冰山主体才是无意识的所在。那里储存着我们被压抑的记忆，被压抑的欲望，被压抑的恐惧。这些东西虽然不在意识层面，但它们默默地影响着我们的一切行为。你有时候无缘无故的心情不好，有时候莫名其妙的害怕某件事，有时候被一个人吸引，自己也说不清楚为什么。弗洛伊德说，这些都是无意识在说话。第二个是性驱力的核心地位，这也是他最受争议的主张之一。弗洛伊德认为性驱力是人类最根本的心理动力，他用了一个德文词叫做利比多，指的是性能量。他认为几乎所有的心理现象都可以追溯到这股力量的流动或压抑。这个说法在维多利亚时代的社会根本就是一枚炸弹。那个时代的人表面上假装性不存在，弗洛伊德却说，性才是一切的根源。你可以想象当时保守社会的震惊。第三个是伊底帕斯情结，这个词来自古希腊神话中的伊底帕斯王。他在不知情的情况下杀死了父亲，娶了母亲。弗洛伊德认为男孩在3到5岁之间都会经历一个对母亲有爱恋之情，同时对父亲有竞争和嫉妒的阶段。他认为这是人类心理发展的普遍现象。后来他也为女孩提出了类似的概念。这些理论在当时引发了轩然大波，维多利亚时代的人根本无法接受，说孩子对父母有那样的情感，简直是大逆不道。但弗洛伊德不在乎，他说真相从来不怕被说出来。第四个是3层人格结构理论，本我、自我和超我，这是他后期提出的理论。本我是我们最原始的冲动，想要快乐，想要满足，不管后果，就像一个被宠坏的孩子，立刻要糖果，不然就哭。自我是现实原则，他试图在本我的冲动和现实世界之间找到平衡，就像一个精明的管家，把家里所有人的需求协调好。超我是道德原则，是父母和社会的声音在我们心中的内化，就像一个永远在旁边评判你的法官，说你这样做不对，你那样做才符合规矩。这3个力量永远在拉扯，人的心理健康与否，就看这3者之间的关系是否和谐。第5个是防御机制，压抑是把不舒服的想法推进无意识， 投射是把自己的感受归咎给别人，合理化是用一个说得通的理由来解释自己其实说不通的行为，比如工作出了问题，却告诉自己是老板嫉妒，这就是合理化。升华是把不被接受的冲动转化成社会认可的活动，比如把攻击性转化成运动竞技，把旺盛的能量转化成艺术创作。1902年，弗洛伊德开始在家里举办每周三的聚会，邀请对精神分析感兴趣的人前来讨论。一开始只有4-5个人，聚在他家的客厅里，抽着雪茄，讨论梦和无意识。这个聚会后来发展成维也纳精神分析学会，很多后来赫赫有名的人物都从这里出发。其中最重要的2个人是阿尔弗雷德·阿德勒和卡尔·古斯塔夫·荣格。荣格是瑞士人，比弗洛伊德年轻19岁。弗洛伊德非常欣赏荣格，把他视为自己的精神继承人，称他为王储。2人之间的往来书信多达300多封，那种亲密几乎像父子。但这段关系后来破裂了。荣格不同意弗洛伊德把性冲动放在如此核心的地位，他认为无意识不只是个人的，还有更大的集体无意识，那是全人类共享的心理遗产，里面有原型，有神话，有超越个人经验的象征。弗洛伊德觉得这太神秘了，太不科学了。2人最终分道扬镳，各自开创了不同的流派。这段大师之间的恩怨在心理学史上是相当有名的公案。阿德勒也跟弗洛伊德闹翻了。阿德勒的观点更强调社会因素和自卑感，而不是性和无意识。他认为人的核心动力是追求卓越，是要克服自卑感。弗洛伊德对分裂者向来毫不客气，他会把不同意他的人从他的圈子里彻底排除，这让人看到他个性中相当强硬的一面。他的追随者有时候需要用忠诚来换取他的友谊，这种模式在他的圈子里制造了很多紧张。1909年，弗洛伊德生命中有个重要的时刻，他受邀前往美国麻州的克拉克大学演讲，这是精神分析第一次在国际舞台上正式亮相。他在船上跟荣格说了一句话，他说他们不知道我带去的是瘟疫。这句话后来有很多种解读，有人说他是在自嘲，有人说他是在预言。无论如何，精神分析就这样踏上了美洲大陆，并且在20世纪中期席卷美国心理治疗界。一次世界大战给弗洛伊德带来了很大的冲击。战争中，他看到了人类的破坏冲动，那些欢呼雀跃地走向战场的年轻人，那种对死亡和毁灭的渴望，让他百思不解。他原先的理论无法完全解释这个现象。他在1920年出版了一篇文章，里面提出了死亡驱力的概念。他认为人类不只有求生和追求快乐的本能，也有朝向死亡和毁灭的冲动。他把这2种力量称为爱力和死力。爱力是建构的力量，死力是解构的力量。这个理论在他自己的学派内部也引发了很大的争议，很多追随者不愿意接受，认为这已经走出了科学的范畴。1923年，弗洛伊德被诊断出口腔癌，他一生抽了大量的雪茄，每天最多抽20支，甚至在医生警告后仍然停不下来。他说雪茄是他最好的朋友，帮助他思考，帮助他工作。此后16年，他经历了33次口腔手术，忍受着难以想象的疼痛。他的上颚几乎被完全切除，需要带着一个巨大的假牙装置，吃东西变得非常困难，说话也受到影响。但他继续工作，继续写作，继续接受病人的治疗。他的女儿安娜·弗洛伊德在这段时期成为他的守护者，他陪伴在侧，协助他的工作。后来自己也成为了一位杰出的精神分析师，专注于儿童心理分析。父女之间的关系是弗洛伊德晚年生命中最重要的情感支柱。1933年，纳粹在德国掌权，弗洛伊德的书被列为禁书，在柏林的广场上被公开焚烧。据说弗洛伊德听到这个消息后冷冷地说，多大的进步啊，在中世纪他们会烧我这个人，如今只是烧我的书。这句话展现了他在压力下的幽默， 但黑色幽默背后是真实的危险。1938年，纳粹占领奥地利，弗洛伊德的女儿安娜被盖世太保逮捕审问，虽然后来获释，但这个事件让所有人都意识到，留在维也纳太危险了。在各方奔走协助下，包括英国政府和罗斯福总统的干预，以及他的学生琼斯奔走安排，弗洛伊德终于离开了他生活了78年的维也纳，流亡伦敦。他在维也纳火车站登上火车那一刻，据说泪流满面。到伦敦后不过1年，1939年9月23日，弗洛伊德在剧烈的癌症疼痛中，请求他的医生马克思舒尔履行之前的承诺，给他注射过量的吗啡，结束生命。他去世时83岁，距离2次世界大战爆发只过了23天。他没有看到战争结束，但他的4个姐妹没有那么幸运，她们都死在了纳粹的集中营里。现在让我们来谈一个很重要的问题：弗洛伊德的理论到底是不是科学？这是一个争议了将近100年的问题。哲学家卡尔·波普尔提出了一个著名的标准，叫做可证伪性。他说，一个理论如果无法被任何实验或观察所推翻，它就不是科学。而弗洛伊德的理论恰恰很难被证伪，因为无论病人做什么，精神分析师都可以找到一个解释。比如，你同意分析师的说法，那说明你有了洞察；你不同意，那说明你在抗拒。这种解释体系密不透风，让他很难接受科学验证。现代神经科学对弗洛伊德的一些概念也提出质疑。梦的功能现代研究显示，更多是记忆整合和情绪调节，而不是压抑欲望的伪装。恋母情结作为普遍现象的说法也缺乏跨文化的实证支持。压抑作为一种心理机制虽然有一定依据，但它的运作方式跟弗洛伊德描述的并不完全一致。但是我们不能因此就全盘否定弗洛伊德。他做到了几件非常重要的事。第一，他让心理问题从耻辱变成了可以讨论的事。在他之前，精神疾病要么被视为道德败坏，要么被视为神灵附身。他把心理治疗带进了现代医学的框架，这是一个革命性的贡献。第二，他开创了谈话治疗。今天我们习以为常的心理咨商，其根源可以追溯到弗洛伊德的诊疗室，坐下来跟一个受训的人说话，把心里的事说出来，让问题在语言中得到澄清。这个基本模式至今仍然有效。现代研究也确认了谈话治疗的真实效用。第三，他把童年经历放进了对成年人格的理解中。虽然他对童年发展的具体理论今天有很多修正，但他提醒了我们是有历史的存在，过去发生的事会继续在我们身上作用。这个直觉被后来的依附理论和发展心理学所证实。第四，它影响了整个20世纪的文化、文学和电影、艺术和广告，都深受精神分析的影响。超现实主义就直接受惠于他的梦与无意识理论。萨尔瓦多·达利对弗洛伊德推崇备至，他们2人在1938年真的见面了。达利画了一幅弗洛伊德的速写，弗洛伊德看了之后说，我以前从没看过任何一张西班牙人的脸如此完整地显示出狂热的特质，这算是赞美还是批评，就留给你自己判断了。弗洛伊德有一句名言，哪里有本我，哪里就应该有自我。这句话的意思是，心理治疗的目标是让人能够清醒地面对自己的冲动，而不是任由他们在黑暗中掌控自己。这大概是他留给我们最珍贵的一课，不是哪个具体的理论，而是一种态度，愿意往自己心里的黑暗看一眼，然后说，好吧，我看到了，现在我可以选择怎么做。弗洛伊德这个人充满矛盾，他是天才也是偏执者，是先驱也是独裁者。他的理论改变了世界，但其中很多已经被推翻。他是一个让你很难简单地说喜欢或不喜欢的人，但如果没有他，我们今天理解自己的方式会完全不同。无意识这个概念，即便今天用神经科学的语言重新包装，它的核心直觉仍然成立。我们有大量的心理活动发生在意识觉察之外，这些活动影响着我们的感受和行动。 弗洛伊德是第一个敢于系统性的把这件事说出来的人。他的盒子一旦打开，就再也关不上了。感谢你今天跟 Jenny 一起认识了弗洛伊德。如果你对今天的内容有感触，欢迎在留言区告诉我，你觉得无意识这件事，你自己有没有感受到它的存在？我很想知道你的故事。别忘了按赞订阅，开启小铃铛。我们下次见咯。Hello everyone, I'm Jenny. Welcome to Thinker J. Have you ever stopped to wonder about something strange? Every decision you think you made freely, every emotion you think you chose, every preference and fear and desire you experience is simply your own. What if something else was already pulling the strings? Something hidden deep inside you. Something you cannot directly see or touch. A force that moves before your conscious mind even wakes up. A force that has been operating in the background your entire life, shaping your choices before you know you are making them. That force has a name. It is called the unconscious. And the man who first tore open the curtain and showed it to us, who looked at the hidden architecture of the human mind, and said, look at what is actually hiding in there, was a Viennese doctor named Sigmund Freud, born in 1856, dead in 1939, and still, more than 80 years later, inescapably present in the way we talk about ourselves, in the language we use for our inner lives, in the assumption, so ordinary now that we barely notice it, that the mind has depths that the ordinary conscious self cannot fully access. He opened a box that could never be closed again, and from that moment forward, humanity could no longer pretend to fully understand itself. I am Jenny. Welcome to the Tribute to the Masters series. Today we are going to step inside the extraordinary life and mind of the man who changed how we see ourselves forever. A man of genius and of limitation, of courage and of stubbornness, of revolutionary insight and of significant error. A man, in other words, who was entirely human, which may be the most appropriate thing you can say about the person who spent his life insisting on the complexity of being human. Sigmund Freud was born on May 6, 1856, in a small town called Freiburg, in what was then the Austro-Hungarian Empire. That town is now part of the Czech Republic. His father Jacob Freud was a wool merchant, a Jewish man of modest means. His mother Amalia was 20 years younger than his father, and she absolutely adored her firstborn son. She called him her golden CG. She believed from the very beginning that he was destined for greatness, that this particular child had been singled out by fate for something extraordinary. Freud later wrote that a man who has been the undisputed favorite of his mother keeps throughout life the feeling of being a conqueror. That confidence never left him, for better and for worse. His courage and self-belief throughout an often hostile career carried traces of that original maternal devotion. When Freud was 4 years old, the family moved to Vienna. That city would become his stage for the next 78 years. He was the oldest of 8 children, and from the very beginning he showed a remarkable mind. He mastered 8 languages over the course of his life: German, Hebrew, Latin, Greek, English, French, Italian and Spanish. The family apartment was small and crowded, but his parents gave him his own room with an oil lamp, while his siblings shared the dimmer communal light. Because everyone in the family understood that this child was different. This child needed the best conditions they could provide. In 1873, at age 17, Freud enrolled in the medical school at the University of Vienna. He had originally been drawn to law, but after hearing a public reading of an essay on nature, attributed to the great poet Goethe, he changed direction entirely and decided to pursue natural science. That essay painted nature as something poetic and knowable at the same time, and it ignited something in the young Freud that never went out. His path through medical school was anything but straightforward. It took him 8 years to complete his degree, because along the way he made a lengthy detour into the laboratory of a zoologist named Bruck, where he spent considerable time searching for the reproductive organs of eels. Yes, eels. His very first research project was trying to locate eel testicles. He examined over 400 eels. He never found what he was looking for. The research ended without a definitive conclusion. But as Freud might have said, even a failure teaches us something about ourselves. The laboratory discipline he acquired during that detour became part of the foundation everything else was built on. He finally received his medical degree in 1881 and began working at the Vienna General Hospital. His early ambitions were actually in neuroscience. He did serious and respected work in brain anatomy, and he made one genuinely significant pharmacological discovery. He found that cocaine had properties as a local anesthetic. This discovery caused considerable excitement in the medical community. An ophthalmologist later used the idea to perform the first eye surgery under local anesthesia. Freud had moved on to other interests before fully developing the finding. And so that particular piece of medical history went to someone else. Cocaine also brought him a moment of professional shame. He recommended it to a close friend named Fleischl who was struggling with morphine dependence. The friend recovered from the morphine problem, but then became severely dependent on cocaine instead. This was one chapter of his career that Freud preferred not to revisit, and it foreshadowed a pattern he would encounter again and again. The gap between a brilliant intuition and a careful, responsible application. In 1885, Freud received a travel grant that would change the entire direction of his life. He went to Paris to study with the great neurologist Jean-Martin Charcot. Charcot was the leading expert of his time on a condition called hysteria. Every week he would conduct public demonstrations at the Salpêtrière Hospital, showing patients who were experiencing paralysis, blindness, or convulsions, with no apparent physical cause. The medical establishment was baffled. Charcot believed the source was in the mind rather than in the body. Freud watched these demonstrations with extraordinary attention. Charcot was not only a scientist but a performer. His public lectures were theatrical events. Patients were hypnotized in front of the audience. Under specific suggestions they would develop dramatic symptoms, then recover instantly when told to. This was not theater for its own sake. It was a demonstration of a genuine principle. The mind has real power over the body. Invisible forces inside us can produce visible effects we cannot explain away. A question formed in Freud that would never leave him. If the body is healthy, why is the person suffering? The answer had to be somewhere in the psychology. When he returned to Vienna, Freud began collaborating with a physician named Joseph Breuer. Breuer was a respected internist and a man of genuine intellectual generosity. He was older than Freud and had been something of a mentor to him. He had been treating a remarkable patient, who in the published case study was given the name Anna O. Her real name was Bertha Pappenheim, and she later became one of the founders of social work in Germany. But at the time Breuer was treating her, she had developed a range of baffling symptoms. Partial paralysis, visual disturbances, difficulties with speech. Sometimes she forgot how to speak German entirely and could only communicate in English. The symptoms had no detectable physical cause. Medical examination after medical examination came back normal. But the suffering was entirely real. Breuer discovered that when he allowed her to speak freely under hypnosis, talking through memories and feelings that had never been given expression, tracing symptoms back to specific moments and experiences, the symptoms would temporarily disappear. He called this the cathartic method, the talking cure, the idea that speaking your inner experience aloud, in the right kind of attentive presence, could bring genuine relief. Not through medication, not through surgery, but through language. That idea planted something enormously important in Freud. There is an interesting footnote to the Anna O case. The patient eventually developed a powerful emotional attachment to Breuer himself. She even reported a phantom pregnancy, claiming it was his child. This understandably alarmed Breuer enormously. He ended the treatment abruptly and took his wife on a restorative holiday. Freud later turned this kind of emotional projection from patient to therapist into one of the central concepts of psychoanalytic technique. He called it transference. The way patients unconsciously transfer feelings from significant figures in their past onto the therapist in the present, rather than seeing it as a problem to be avoided. He saw it as the most important raw material of the therapeutic process. The emotions that emerged in the consulting room were not interruptions to the work. They were the work itself. In 1896, Freud lost his father. The grief hit him with surprising force. He wrote to a friend that he felt as if a door had been permanently closed. Something fundamental had shifted. He described it as the most profound loss a person can experience. In the aftermath, he undertook something that no physician had done before. He turned the tools of analysis on himself. He began recording his own dreams every morning, writing them down in careful detail immediately upon waking, before the images faded and the logic of the daylight mind reasserted itself. Then he analyzed each element with the same clinical attention he gave to his patients. What was the strange figure in the dream from last night? What did that particular symbol keep returning to mean? Why did a certain memory surface at that particular moment? He traced his earliest memories back into childhood. He examined his own desires and fears with unflinching and sometimes uncomfortable honesty. He noticed patterns that embarrassed him. contradictions between what he believed about himself and what the dream material suggested. He wrote about all of it. This self-analysis lasted for years. It was a genuinely unprecedented act of intellectual courage, and it became the foundation of everything that followed. Without that painful inward turn, there would have been no interpretation of dreams, no theory of the unconscious, no psychoanalysis as we know it. In 1900, Freud published the book he considered the most important work of his life. It was called The Interpretation of Dreams. In it he argued that dreams are not random noise from a sleeping brain. Dreams are the royal road to the unconscious. Every dream, he said, is a disguised fulfillment of a suppressed wish. The dream takes something the conscious mind cannot accept, wraps it in symbols and distortions and condensations, and presents it in a form the sleeping mind can tolerate. He called the surface content of the dream the manifest content, and the underlying psychological material the latent content. Dreams were like coded letters. What they showed on the surface was almost never what they actually meant. When the book came out, almost nobody noticed. The first edition sold 351 copies. It took 8 years to sell out that small print run. For a man of the enormous self-belief of Freud, that silence was a particularly bitter kind of failure. He had predicted the book would be remembered 100 years later. He was right about that. It just did not take 100 years. He kept going. He continued building his theoretical framework with relentless energy. And over the following years he introduced ideas that would enter the everyday language of the modern world. Ideas that billions of people now use without knowing where they came from. The first and most fundamental was the unconscious itself. Freud compared the mind to an iceberg. The conscious part, the thoughts and feelings we are aware of, is the small tip visible above the waterline. The vast bulk of the iceberg sits below the surface, hidden from view. That is the unconscious. It holds our repressed memories, our forbidden desires, our buried fears and unresolved conflicts. We cannot see it directly, but it shapes everything we do. You sometimes feel sad for no reason you can name. You are sometimes afraid of something that should not frighten you. You are sometimes drawn to a person and cannot explain why. Freud said these experiences are the unconscious speaking, not randomly, but in a language that can be learned and understood. The second major idea involved what he called libido, sexual energy. Freud argued that this energy is the fundamental driving force of human psychology. Almost every significant psychological phenomenon could in his view be traced back to the flow or the blockage of this energy. A person who was anxious was not simply a nervous person. They were someone in whom sexual energy was being blocked or redirected in a particular way. A person who was excessively moral and rigid was someone in whom the energy had been suppressed to the point of distortion. Even creative achievement, he argued, was largely sublimated sexual energy, redirected into art or science or intellectual work. This was an absolute explosion in Victorian society. That era was characterized by a kind of collective pretense that sexuality barely existed among respectable people, that the body and its desires were something to be controlled and hidden, that to even acknowledge certain impulses was itself a form of indecency. Freud said the opposite. He said sexuality is the root of almost everything, including the things that look the furthest from it. The anxious housewife, the rigid schoolmaster, the ambitious politician, the tormented artist. All of them, in his view, were people whose sexual energy was expressing itself in disguised forms. You can imagine the scandal. You can imagine the outrage of a society built on the fiction that proper people did not have such things. And here was this Jewish doctor from Vienna, insisting not only that they did, but that their most respectable achievements were secretly made of exactly the material they most wished to deny. The third major idea was the Oedipus complex. Drawing on the ancient Greek myth of King Oedipus, who unknowingly killed his father and married his mother, Freud argued that young boys pass through a developmental phase, in which they experience something like attraction toward the mother, and rivalry and anxiety in relation to the father. He identified a parallel process in girls as well. These ideas caused absolute outrage in Victorian society. The suggestion that children harbored such feelings was considered not just wrong but indecent and even monstrous. Freud was genuinely unmoved by the outrage. He had never been particularly interested in being liked. He was interested in being right, and he believed in the truth of what he had found. The fourth major contribution came later in his career. He developed what he called the structural model of the mind, divided into three parts: the ID, the ego, and the superego. The ID is the original self, the raw bundle of instincts and desires that want immediate satisfaction. It operates on what Freud called the pleasure principle. Give me what I want, and give it to me now. It does not negotiate. It does not wait. It does not care about consequences. The ego is the realistic self. It tries to satisfy the ID while also navigating the demands of the real world. It operates on the reality principle. It is the part of us that can delay gratification, that can think ahead, that can look at an impulsive urge and say, not now, not here, not in this way. The ego is the negotiator, the diplomat of the inner world. The superego is the moral self. It is the internalized voice of parents and society, the part of us that judges and criticizes and sets standards. That tells us when we have fallen short of what we should be. It can be a valuable guide, but it can also become a tyrant. When the superego is too powerful and too rigid, it produces not virtue but paralysis, not morality but crushing guilt. These three forces are in constant negotiation. The health of the psyche depends on whether they can find a workable balance. Too much ID and we become impulsive and destructive. Too much superego and we become rigid and full of guilt and unable to enjoy anything. The ego has the genuinely difficult job of keeping everyone in the room talking to each other. Freud thought that most psychological suffering could be understood as a breakdown in this internal negotiation, as one part of the self overwhelming the others, or as the system as a whole becoming unable to deal with the pressures placed on it. The fifth major contribution was the theory of defense mechanisms. Although it was his daughter Anna Freud who developed this into a more complete and systematic form, the essential insight came from him. Repression means pushing an uncomfortable feeling or memory down into the unconscious, so we do not have to deal with it consciously. Projection means attributing your own feelings to someone else. If you are angry at your friend but cannot admit it, you start to believe your friend is angry at you. Rationalization means inventing a logical-sounding explanation for something you actually did for entirely different reasons. You missed the meeting not because you were avoiding a difficult conversation, but because you were simply too busy. Of course. Sublimation means redirecting an unacceptable impulse into something socially valued. Channeling aggression into competitive sport. Channeling restless energy into creative work. These words are now part of ordinary conversation worldwide. Most people who use them have no idea they came from Freud. In 1902, Freud began hosting Wednesday evening gatherings at his home on Bergasse 19, open to anyone interested in his ideas. The first meeting had 4 people, sitting in his study, smoking cigars, talking about dreams and desire. That small circle eventually grew into the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society, and from that group emerged some of the most influential figures in the history of psychology. Among them were Alfred Adler and Carl Gustav Jung. Jung was Swiss, 19 years younger than Freud, and Freud saw in him not just a gifted thinker but a successor. He called Jung his crown prince. He hoped Jung would carry psychoanalysis into the future and protect its legacy. The two men exchanged over 300 letters. Their relationship had the intensity of something between a close friendship and a father and son bond. That relationship ended badly. Jung believed Freud placed excessive emphasis on sexuality as the central force in human psychology. Jung wanted to expand the concept of the unconscious beyond the personal level and into what he called the collective unconscious, a shared reservoir of symbols and archetypes common to all of humanity. The great myths, the universal images, the deep patterns that appear across cultures and across history. Freud found this too mystical, too unscientific, too far from the concrete clinical work that had built everything he valued. The two men broke off their collaboration and went on to found entirely separate schools of thought. The falling out between Freud and Jung remains one of the most famous intellectual separations in modern history. Adler parted ways with Freud as well. Adler believed the drive for power and significance, and the experience of inferiority, were more central to human psychology than sexuality. Freud was not gracious about disagreement within his circle. When colleagues broke away, he typically severed contact completely and sometimes wrote about them with contempt. This revealed a side of his personality that was genuinely difficult. He could be warm and generous to those who accepted his framework, but he required loyalty, and he punished those who withheld it. In 1909, Freud received an invitation from Clark University in Massachusetts to give a series of lectures in the United States. This was the first major international recognition of psychoanalysis as a serious intellectual movement. G. Stanley Hall, the psychologist who organized the event, was one of the very few Americans who had been paying attention to the work of Freud. He saw something important in it, and he wanted to bring it to a wider audience. on the ship crossing the Atlantic. Freud turned to Jung and made a remark that has been quoted in every biography ever since. He said they do not realize we are bringing them the plague. Whether he meant it as self-deprecating humor or genuine prophecy, nobody is entirely sure, but there was something playfully prophetic about it, because psychoanalysis did sweep across America in the following decades, with an enthusiasm that actually surprised Freud himself. Americans, he noticed, had a particular appetite for self-improvement, for systems that promised to explain human behavior, for ideas that could be applied practically. Psychoanalysis offered all of that, and it became the dominant framework in American psychiatry and psychotherapy for much of the 20th century. By the 1950s, the influence was so complete that a significant portion of American novelists and filmmakers had themselves been through some form of analysis, and were writing characters who thought in explicitly Freudian terms. The couch, the analyst, the childhood trauma, the repressed desire. These had become the basic furniture of the American cultural imagination. World War I shook Freud deeply. He had 2 sons fighting in the war, and the anxiety of a father was layered on top of the shock of a thinker. The scale of human destruction was almost impossible to comprehend. Millions dead. Civilized nations reduced to mutual slaughter. But what disturbed Freud most deeply was not the scale but the enthusiasm. The way ordinary young men had marched toward the guns with something close to joy. The way crowds had cheered. The way violence had been welcomed rather than reluctantly endured. He had believed that even aggression and destruction could ultimately be traced back to frustrated libido, to thwarted desire seeking an outlet. But the war seemed to suggest something darker and more fundamental. Something that could not be explained purely in terms of blocked pleasure. People were not just releasing frustration. They seemed to want destruction for its own sake. In 1920 he published a paper called Beyond the Pleasure Principle, that introduced one of his most controversial and disturbing concepts, the death drive. He now argued that alongside the instinct for life and pleasure, there exists in all of us an equally powerful drive toward dissolution and death, toward the undoing of complexity, toward return to a simpler, quieter state. He called these 2 opposing forces Eros and Thanatos, life and death, creation and destruction, love and the compulsion to destroy. He believed that history and civilization were the record of this ongoing struggle between the force that binds us together and the force that tears us apart. Even within his own circle this idea was met with significant resistance. Many of his most devoted followers found it too dark, too speculative, too far removed from the clinical observations that had earned them all their credibility. But Freud held to it. He thought it was the most honest account of what he had seen, in the consulting room and in the wider world. In 1923, Freud was diagnosed with cancer of the jaw and palate. He had smoked heavily his entire adult life, up to 20 cigars per day. Even after doctors warned him to stop, he refused. He once said that abstaining from cigars was simply more than he was able to bear. He described them as indispensable to him as a tool of thought. The cancer required surgery after surgery. Over the remaining 16 years of his life, he underwent 33 operations. He endured constant and often severe pain. A large portion of his upper jaw and palate was removed. He wore a prosthetic device in his mouth. That made eating and speaking genuinely difficult. But he continued seeing patients, continued writing major theoretical works, continued engaging with the intellectual debates of his time. His daughter Anna managed the practical aspects of his life, and became in those years both his primary caregiver and his closest intellectual companion. In 1933, the Nazis came to power in Germany. Freud was not initially alarmed. He was in his late 70s and had lived through many storms. But when Nazi students organized public burnings of books across Germany, his books were among those thrown into the flames. He reportedly responded with characteristic dark wit. He said, "What progress we are making. In the Middle Ages they would have burned me personally. Now they are content to burn my books." But the wit masked real danger. In 1938, Germany annexed Austria. The Freud family was now in direct and immediate peril. His daughter Anna was detained and interrogated by the Gestapo for an entire day. She was released. But the message was unmistakable. It took considerable international pressure to secure Freud's safe passage out of the country, including diplomatic intervention from the British government and from President Roosevelt. His student Ernest Jones worked frantically behind the scenes to arrange everything. Finally, at the age of 82, Freud boarded a train at the Westbahnhof station in Vienna and left the city where he had lived since the age of 4, where he had built his career. his family, his life work. He is said to have wept as the train pulled out of the station. He arrived in London and settled in a house in Hampstead in North London. That house is now the Freud Museum. You can still visit it today and see his famous couch, the antique furniture, the archaeological figurines he collected throughout his life. He had less than a year left. By September 1939, the cancer had advanced beyond any further treatment. The pain had become unbearable. Freud asked his physician Max Schur to honor a promise made years earlier. On September 23, 1939, Schur administered a fatal dose of morphine. Freud died peacefully that night at the age of 83. World War II had broken out just 23 days before his death. His 4 sisters, who had remained in Vienna, were later murdered in Nazi concentration camps. Now let us turn to the question that haunts Freud more than any other. Was psychoanalysis actually science? This debate has been running for nearly a century and it is not resolved. The philosopher Karl Popper introduced a concept called falsifiability. He argued that a theory is genuinely scientific only if it can in principle be proven wrong by some possible observation or experiment. The problem with psychoanalysis, he said, is that it is unfalsifiable. Whatever a patient does can be explained by the system. If you agree with the analyst, that shows insight and progress. If you disagree, that shows resistance and denial. If you get better, the theory is confirmed. If you do not get better, the theory explains that too. A framework that can explain everything explains nothing, because it cannot be tested against reality in a meaningful way. This was a devastating critique when Popper first made it, and it has not lost its force in the decades since. There is also the problem of what researchers call confirmation bias. Freud interpreted his case material in light of his existing theories, and his theories were built from his interpretation of his case material. The circularity is hard to escape. When he examined a patient and found evidence of the Oedipus complex, was he discovering something real? Or was he shaping the conversation and the interpretation in ways that would inevitably produce the evidence he expected? These are not comfortable questions, but they are serious ones. Modern neuroscience has complicated the picture further. Dream research now suggests that dreaming serves functions related to memory consolidation and emotional regulation, not primarily the disguised expression of repressed wishes. The specific imagery of dreams appears to be generated by relatively random neural processes, and then shaped by the sleeping mind into narratives it can use. The Oedipus complex as a universal developmental stage lacks convincing cross-cultural empirical support. Anthropologists studying cultures with very different family structures have not found the pattern Freud described. The hydraulic model of the mind, with drives building up pressure like steam and seeking release, does not match what neuroscience has revealed about how the brain actually works, and controlled clinical trials have consistently found that psychoanalytic therapy does not outperform shorter and considerably less expensive approaches for most of the conditions it claims to treat. Cognitive behavioral therapy, for instance, produces comparable or better results in a fraction of the time. These findings have led many researchers to conclude that psychoanalysis belongs in the history of ideas, rather than in the toolkit of evidence-based medicine. And yet to dismiss Freud entirely would be its own kind of intellectual error, because the failure of some of his specific theories does not cancel the genuine contributions he made, or the real transformation he brought about in how we understand ourselves. Consider what he actually accomplished. First, he destigmatized mental suffering. Before Freud, psychological distress was largely attributed to moral weakness or supernatural causes. A person who could not function was either sinful or possessed, either weak in character or cursed by God. Freud insisted that the suffering of the mind deserved the same serious attention as the suffering of the body. That psychological symptoms were not signs of weakness or sin, but meaningful responses to real experiences. That they could be understood, and if understood, potentially relieved. That act of insisting was revolutionary. It changed medicine. It changed how courts thought about criminal responsibility. It changed how educators thought about children. It changed how families talked about their troubled members. The mentally ill were not monsters or sinners. They were people in pain who deserved compassion and care. We take that for granted today. We should not take for granted that someone had to fight to establish it. Second, he invented the talking cure as a systematic practice. The therapy session as we know it today. Sitting across from a trained listener. Speaking your inner experience aloud. Working through memories and feelings in language. Noticing what comes up unexpectedly. Exploring what you avoid. That basic structure traces directly back to the consulting room at Bergasse 19. He made the conversation itself into a therapeutic instrument. He gave us the idea that being heard, really heard, in a particular kind of attentive and non-judgmental way, could produce genuine psychological change. Subsequent research has confirmed that various forms of talking therapy genuinely help people, even when the specific Freudian mechanisms are not the ones doing the work. Third, he established that childhood matters. The specific theories about childhood sexuality have been substantially revised, but the central intuition that early experience shapes the adult is now confirmed by attachment theory, developmental psychology, and neuroscience. We are historical beings. What happened to us in the early years leaves traces that echo forward. The way we learn to relate to caregivers, the way early experiences of safety or danger became encoded in our nervous systems. These things follow us. They shape our relationships, our emotional responses, our patterns of thought. Freud did not get the mechanism right, but he got the basic truth right, and he made it something that medicine and psychology could no longer ignore. Fourth, he transformed the culture of the 20th century. Literature, cinema, art, and advertising were all filtered through a Freudian lens. Surrealism drew directly from his theory of dreams and the unconscious. The idea that the image language of the sleeping mind contains a deeper truth than the rational surface of waking life. Salvador Dali met Freud in London in 1938. Near the end of both their lives, Dali came away with a sketch of the old man. Freud looked at Dali and said he had never before seen a Spanish face that so completely displayed the signs of a fanatic. Whether that was a compliment depends entirely on your perspective. But the cultural debt was enormous either way. The language of therapy, the concepts of the unconscious, of repression, of projection, have passed into ordinary speech in every language on earth. When someone says they are projecting, or that their boss has an ego problem, or that they need to process something, they are speaking in a language that Freud built, without knowing it, without knowing him. Freud once wrote something that has stayed with me. He said that where ID was, their ego shall be. What he meant was this: the goal of psychological work is not to eliminate our darker impulses. It is to make them conscious, to see them clearly, to name them honestly, so that instead of being driven by forces we cannot identify, we can choose how to respond. We can move from being ruled in the dark to being able to act in the light. There is something almost heroic about that aspiration, even if Freud himself did not always live up to it. He could be authoritarian and intolerant of disagreement. He could be blind to his own biases. He could defend his theories with more certainty than the evidence warranted. But the aspiration itself, the idea that self-knowledge is possible, that the painful work of turning inward has real value, that we owe it to ourselves and to others to understand what is actually driving us, that aspiration is genuinely noble, and it has outlasted the specific theories that expressed it. Think about what daily life looked like before Freud. People experienced anxiety and depression and compulsion and grief. Of course they did. Human beings have always had inner lives. But there was no widely shared vocabulary for talking about them. There was no commonly understood framework for thinking about psychological pain. And there was certainly no established practice of sitting with a trained person and speaking about the inner life with the expectation that doing so might help. All of that is post-Freudian. We are all, in some sense, living in the world he made. That is the inheritance. Not a perfect theory, not an infallible method, not a complete and accurate map of the mind, but an insistence that we look, that we refuse the comfortable lie that everything happening inside us is fully known and understood, that we have the courage to turn the lamp inward, even when what we find there is not flattering, even when the view is uncomfortable, even when the truth about ourselves is more complicated than the story we prefer. Freud was a man of profound contradictions. Brilliant and dogmatic, visionary and mistaken, compassionate toward his patients and ruthless toward his rivals. He smoked himself into agony and refused to stop. He was fiercely certain and occasionally catastrophically wrong. He was not easy to like. He was not always right. But the world he left behind is one where we take the inner life seriously, where we believe that talking about pain can help, where we understand that much of what drives us moves in the dark, and that the first step toward freedom is to shine a light. He handed us that lamp. And that is no small thing. Thank you so much for joining me today on this journey into the life and legacy of Sigmund Freud. If this episode gave you something to think about, I would love to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever had a moment where you suddenly understood something about yourself? Something that had been quietly running the show without your knowing? Tell me your story. Do not forget to like, subscribe and hit the notification bell. See you next time.